Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for tuning in tonight. My name is Kate Bruns, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I am so pleased to introduce this event with Gary Taubes, presenting his latest book, The Case for Keto, Rethinking Weight Control and the Science and Practice of Low-Carb, High-Fat Eating, joined in conversation by Gretchen Rubin. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our ever-expanding digital community during these unprecedented times. We host virtual events like tonight's 5 times a week. You can find our event schedule on our website at harvard.com/events, or you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our bookshelves from home. This evening's discussion is going to conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for Gary or Gretchen at any time during the talk tonight, please submit it through the Q&A button, which you can locate at the bottom of your screen. We're going to get through as many as time allows for. And in a couple of minutes in the Zoom chat, I'm going to be sharing a link to purchase tonight's featured book, The Case for Keto. If you would like to support our store in a different way, I will also be sharing a donation link for Harvard Bookstore. Thank you from the bottom of our book-selling hearts for your patronage during this time. It makes this virtual author series possible, and now, more than ever, ensures the future of a landmark independent bookstore. And finally, as you've likely experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise, and if they do, we're going to do our best to resolve them quickly, so thank you for your patience and your understanding. And now, I'm very excited to introduce tonight's speakers. Award-winning science and health journalist Gary Taubes is the author of The Case Against Sugar, Why We Get Fat, and Good Calories, Bad Calories. He is the co-founder and director of the nonprofit, the Nutrition Science Initiative, which supports research that tests assumptions about the metabolic and hormonal causes of obesity and related metabolic disorders. His work has been widely recognized, earning him 3 Science and Society Journalism Awards, and his writing's been featured in publications such as The Atlantic, Esquire, New York Times Magazine, and the best of the best American science writing. Joining him in conversation tonight is celebrated podcaster, author, and happiness guru, Gretchen Rubin. Her many best-selling books include Outer Order, Inner Calm, The 4 Tendencies, Better Than Before, and The Happiness Project. She discusses these happiness and habit ideas and more on her award-winning podcast, Happier with Gretchen Rubin, co-hosted with her sister, Elizabeth Kraft. And you can check out this week's latest episode for a special interview with Gary as well. And tonight, they'll be discussing Gary's latest best-selling book, The Case for Keto, which shifts how we think about healthy eating. In praise of the book, Gretchen herself writes, drawing on exhaustive research and in clear language, Gary explains which foods are healthy for us, which foods are unhealthy, and why. He shows why obesity, diabetes, hypertension, and other chronic conditions are on the rise and how we can intervene effectively. Gary Taubes' work has changed everything about the way I eat. We are so pleased to have them here in conversation tonight. So without further ado, the digital podium is yours. Gretchen.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much. Thank you to the Harvard Bookstore, a bookstore that I love. And I want to begin before I start asking Gary to explain everything about the case for keto. I want to explain why I am such a believer in Gary Taubes' work. In March of 2012, I was on vacation with my family, and I brought with me Why We Get Fat, because when I had looked at it in my favorite local indie bookstore, I had seen that it was a lot about insulin, and because my sister's a type 1 diabetic, I really wanted to learn about insulin. I read the book in a day, and I changed almost everything about the way that I eat, and I've eaten that way, low carb, high fat, ever since, because I was just so persuaded by the clarity and cogence of Gary's arguments. And my father, who was in his mid-70s and had all the high blood pressure, weight problems, triglycerides, all that stuff, he also decided to start eating this way. And it was like a television commercial where he went into his doctor and his doctor was like, hey, Jack, what have you been doing different? Because everything is so much better. So it truly has changed my life. It has freed me from my draining, boring, insistent sweet tooth, and I'm just so much happier and healthier. And so I'm a huge fan of Gary's work in really highlighting this low carb, high fat and the logic for it. So Gary, with that said, explain the basic principle about what, because the basic argument that you're making is rooted in science that is itself not controversial. So the case for keto is controversial, but the underlying mechanism of it is not controversial. So begin by just explaining for people what is going on in the body with insulin.
Okay. And I will get to that in a second after I thank you for that wonderful invitation and thank Kate and the Harvard bookstore I am also very fond of, for this opportunity. So in order to explain this uncontroversial mechanism, I have to explain the conventional thinking on obesity and overweight, which is we get fat because we eat too much. That's been the thinking since roughly 1930. Not always, but since 1930. And the idea is the difference between if you have two lean people in their teens and one grows up to be fat and the other didn't, the difference is that the one who grew up to be overweight or obese ate too much and the lean one didn't. And what this leaves out entirely is any regulation of any physiological regulation of the processes that actually control how much fat we accumulate in our body. So this was science that was worked out between the 1930s and the 1960s, and it's very well understood. And the hormone insulin, which you discussed, which is dysfunctional in diabetes, is the hormone that dominates the process of fat accumulation. So we think of it as because of diabetes, is a hormone that controls blood sugar. But one of the ways it controls blood sugar is by telling your fat cells to store all the fat you've eaten and to keep storing it so long as insulin is elevated. So what this does, or what it should have done, if the obesity researchers hadn't been so convinced that people who are fat just eat too much, is it should have created the hypothesis that increasing insulin, which happens when you're insulin resistant, which is what happens when you have type 2 diabetes, increasing insulin increases the amount of time your body is storing fat and decreases the amount of time it can mobilize it and makes you fatter. And some of the best researchers in obesity, a woman named Hilda Brooke, who was a leading pediatric obesity researcher in the mid-20th century, Edwin Astwood, who was a leading endocrinologist in the United States in the 1960s and 1970s, even Rosalind Yalow and Solomon Burson, who won the Nobel Prize, Yalow did, for creating the technology necessary to measure insulin in the bloodstream, all postulated that obesity is a disorder not of eating too much, but of sort of fat accumulation. It's almost first principles. You have a disorder of fat accumulation, then obesity is caused by a disorder in the physiological regulation, which is dominated by insulin. So that's a theory behind the ketogenic diet. The way to lower insulin is to remove carbohydrates. And when you remove carbohydrates from your diet, and if you replace them with fat, you'll minimize your insulin. And one thing that will do is tell your liver to synthesize molecules called ketones. And now you're in ketosis and you're technically eating a ketogenic diet. But that's it. It's textbook medicine, simply applied to obesity, which for reasons that still gobsmack me, the obesity research community isn't interested in doing.
But this idea of calories in, calories out, or what's sometimes called the energy imbalance, that is, so many people are persuaded, they kind of feel like, well, that's just obviously fact. So just to go a little bit, that isn't how it works.
So the idea that, if you're getting fatter, you're taking in more energy than you expend. That's the laws of physics. There's no way to avoid it. You can't create energy from nothing. So if your body is accumulating, mass is energy. That's what Einstein taught us. So if your body's getting more massive, you're accumulating energy. And what happened over the years is the obesity community, the nutrition community said, well, okay, so if you're getting fatter, you're taking in more energy than you expend. Therefore, taking in more energy than you expend causes you to get fat. And I've thought a lot about how to explain how nonsensical this is. One way is imagine let's say I had a new book out, instead of calling the case for keto, it was like the case for investing in Tesla. And we were discussing wealth accumulation. And I said, well, the conventional wisdom, everybody knows that in order to get rich, you have to take in more money than you spend. And therefore, the cause of getting rich is money imbalance, positive money imbalance. And you'd say, Gary, duh, that's obvious, right? But that's not the cause. There are a lot of ways people get rich. The idea that obesity is caused by energy imbalance is what logicians would call a tautology. It is an energy imbalance. Getting fatter is an energy imbalance. And what you want to know is why. And then again, because the obesity researchers convince themselves that obesity is an eating disorder, what they study is appetite, how much people eat. Whenever you read about obesity, the latest breakthrough in the paper, it's always trying to explain why people who suffer from obesity might eat too much. Whereas if they thought about obesity as a fat accumulation disorder, which is what it is, they would study the regulation of fat accumulation. And then they would ask, why do fat cells take in more calories and they give up, or store more fat than they mobilize? And that's regulated once again by the hormone insulin. So now we're back to an insulin signaling disorder. And the way to solve it would be to lower insulin levels.
Well, to use your kind of financial metaphor, a metaphor that kind of helped for me to understand this is, think of a fat cell as like an ATM machine. And you have your card and you're sticking it in the machine because you want your cash to come out. But it's as if when insulin is in the air of your banks, where you are in your bank, if there's too much insulin, the bank card won't work. You have the card, you have the machine, you have the money, but the machine won't release the cash to you. But when insulin falls, then all of a sudden your card will work. You put in your code and the cash comes out. But it can't do that when the insulin is too high. So if you want the cash out, what you have to think about is how to get the insulin down, because that's what makes the cash and the card interact in the way that you want. Because it's once you understand it, it seems so obvious. I think another reason that people sort of have a hard time grasping this is because you're really arguing that like fat is fine. And we're also inculcated in this idea that we need to like march around and not eat egg yolks and cut all the fat and eat non-fat yogurt. So talk a little bit about your view on fat.
Okay, and that's clearly the tragedy in all this. I got into this field as an investigative science journalist, looking at the question of whether dietary fat causes heart disease. This was the late 90s. Like everyone else, I was eating a low-fat diet. It was actually even a mostly plant diet. And I was doing investigative pieces for the journal Science, and I got fascinated with this question. And it turned out in the 1950s and 1960s, when this hypothesis was generated that dietary fat causes heart disease through saturated fat raising LDL cholesterol, aka the bad cholesterol, the research community did a series of clinical trials to test the hypothesis, and the hypothesis pretty much failed the test. For every trial that suggested that reducing the saturated fat content of your diet might make you live a little bit longer, and a little bit was maybe 2 weeks to a couple months, there were an equal number of trials, or even more trials, suggesting that it would do more harm than good. But by the 1980s, the public health authorities had gotten involved. The government was telling everyone to eat less fat. And the industry bought into it. Industry was actually pushed to create low-fat products, and they did. They were happy to remove the fat and add back sugar. And the result was this sort of low-fat dogma that we're still living with today, such that for many of us, and this was true for me 20 years ago when I started eating this way, if to confront a plate of eggs cooked in butter and a bacon, is to assume that you're going to die within minutes to maybe a half an hour of eating it. It's very hard, and it's the doctors I interviewed in this book, the physicians, talked about it, the great challenge to getting their patients to accept the fact that they can eat fat with impunity. Because what happens when you eat a mixed meal, with carbs, protein, and fat in it, you actually store the fat you eat. This was also worked out by the 1980s latest. So the fat you eat gets stored immediately while your body tries to deal with the carbohydrates, the raising blood sugar that comes from the carbohydrates. And because of this, it also made the obesity people think, well, if you're storing the fat you eat, then a low-fat diet should solve that problem. But what they didn't think of is that you store the fat you eat, but the carbohydrates you're eating through once again, insulin and a counter hormone called glucagon, regulate how much of that fat you keep locked in the fat cells. So it's the fat you eat that gets stored and the carbohydrates that determine whether it stays stored or not. And then once again, you're stuck with, if you want to get the fat out, you don't reduce the fat content of the diet because the fat will come out freely when insulin is low. You reduce the carbohydrates, so insulin drops in and it allows the fat to come out. Once the nutrition research community in the 1960s bought on this idea that dietary fat was the cause of heart disease, everything went off the rails from there. Until then, the conventional wisdom was that carbohydrates were fattening. A line I quote in all my books was from a 1963 British Journal of Nutrition article, "Every woman knows that carbs are fattening."
Well, doesn't Banting, like way back in the day,
Oh, it goes back
you
to,
have
yeah.
somebody from like 1700 or something talking about
1825, the most famous book ever written about food. I'm sure it's available at the Harvard bookstore because it's still in print 195 years later, 196 years later. The Physiology of Taste by Jean-Antoine Briot-Savarin, famous French gastronome. What makes people fat? Well, he called it the farinaceous elements in the diet, and farinaceous meant starchy and grains, and sugar made it worse. And the only reason he said sugar made it worse in 1825 is because sugar was so expensive and so hard to get in 1825 that he didn't consider it a major contributor. And then the way to reduce your excess girth or your corpulence was to more or less rigidly abstain from farinaceous foods, carbs. And then 1865, the most famous first international best-selling diet book by Banting is published by the late 1900s. Low variations on low-carb, high-fat diets are just standard of care for treating obesity in Europe. And then through the 20th century, the European science kind of gets forgotten in the midst of these cataclysmic wars. And post-World War II, we decide dietary fat causes heart disease. And 150 years of conventional wisdom is thrown out and replaced with this idea that we should be on low-fat diets with mostly plants and eating beans and legumes and whole grains and fruits and all these foods that, if we're predisposed to get fat, are guaranteed to make it happen.
Well, this is a point that you make several times throughout the book, which is that there is such a difference in how different people's bodies will respond. And so what could work for one person and be a healthy diet might for another person lead to very unhealthy results. And so you sort of can't say this is going to work for everyone, or everyone is, your results may differ. And certainly, that's what we see kind of in life, is that certain people can eat a certain way and be fine, and certain people can't.
Right. And then there's sort of two different ways to look at this. One is to say there's a lot of individual variation. And so no diet could possibly work for all people. And the other is to say, look, we see obesity and diabetes epidemics manifest themselves all around the world identically whenever populations start eating Western diets and living Western lifestyles. And the question is, what is it about the Western diet and lifestyle that triggers this obesity and diabetes? And the conventional wisdom is there's just too much food available and everyone suddenly gets lazy and stops being physically active. The sort of wisdom behind keto and a whole dietary movement is that it's the refinement of the carbohydrates we eat and the sugars. Everybody's different, but in everybody, if they want to get the fat out of their fat tissue, if they want to maintain and achieve a healthy weight, and it's going to be true for a 600-pounder and a 200-pounder and a male, female, kids, adults. So the trigger, the connection to their diet is going to go through insulin and glucagon, this counter hormone and whenever insulin goes up, glucagon goes down and vice versa. So they're you can think of it all in terms of insulin. And that's going to be a universal fat storage mechanism. It just is. And like I said, you said, it's textbook medicine. So there are different ways people can lower their insulin or improve their insulin dynamics in their body, but ultimately it's going to be happen by either reducing the carbs they're eating or improving the quality of the carbs.
But I just want to say, if to people watching, if you're really interested in this kind of global argument, which I thought was extraordinarily compelling and fascinating, Gary touches on it in the case for keto, but in the case against sugar, goes into it much more. And the fact is, the world is our laboratory. There are very, very clear patterns throughout the world. So if you're interested in that kind of argument, I would say read The Case Against Sugar, which is also fascinating. One thing that was interesting about this book, Gary, is that you talked to more than 120 doctors, people on the ground, working with patients using keto. So why did you feel like you really wanted to talk to those doctors dealing with patients, and kind of what did you learn from what they were seeing?
Well, you said it yourself, and in effect, you could think of them as on the front line of a obesity and diabetes epidemic. Especially if you're in family medicine or internal medicine today in the U.S. or Canada or Europe, your waiting rooms are full of basically or China, yeah, they're full of people who are suffering from the complications of obesity and diabetes and hypertension. And these were all doctors who they went into medicine because they wanted to make people healthy. They find themselves managing chronic disease, writing prescriptions, and then as the diseases inevitably get worse, which they do, upping the doses or changing the pills. So I wanted to understand their challenge and the challenge to their patients. And it's funny, I was trying to do be a little bit of a guide to other journalists out there who might cover the subject. One of the messages in all this is nutrition has been really ill-served by the journalists who have covered it in the newspapers over the years. In part because what you have to do in this field is depend on the experts and the authorities, as I discussed, even in my investigative pieces for Science, simply made mistakes and got it wrong. They weren't very good at the actually very difficult task of doing science. So what you want to do instead is actually understand what people are seeing. So if you have a physician who is told by all his medical organizations to recommend the Mediterranean diet to his patients, and instead is trying to get them off carbs and get them onto something, a low-carb, high-fat diet or a ketogenic diet that news outlets like U.S. News and World Report in their annual diet ratings considers among the least healthy diets imaginable. I want to understand why and how they think and what is it they saw that would induce them to do that. And what they see is what happened to me and what happened to you and what happened to your father, and that television advertisement, you get the carbs out of your diet and replace it with healthy fats from whole foods, and people get healthy. Chronic diseases obesity will correct itself, is a way to think about it. Type 2 diabetes, there's some of the best studies ever done on dietary therapy show that these diets will put type 2 diabetes into reversal and get people off drugs. So, and part of my job in writing this book is also hoping that the authorities will be open-minded enough that if they see a book called The Case for Keto, they'll think, well, I want to understand what the case is. Let me read what this fellow wrote. And then maybe they'll reach out and speak to these physicians themselves to see the kind of revelatory of a phrase I heard over and over again, is that these doctors can't unsee what happens to their patients when they get them off carbs.
Well, you tell the story of you were talking to a doctor and he said, I have a patient, he's lost 110 pounds, he's off medication, everything's great. And my colleague is saying, oh, but don't you think you need to get him back on his old diet because the way he's eating is so unhealthy? And the doctor's like, how could I possibly tell him to do other than what he's doing? Like, he's obviously so much healthier.
And that's a conflict that arises over and over, and that I discuss. My favorite example of this is this Instagram post from a woman named Rochelle Pletz, who I think Rochelle lived in Wisconsin or lives in Wisconsin. And she had gone from, 340 pounds to 230 pounds on a ketogenic diet. And she said, I lost 110 pounds on this diet. And my coworkers are worried that I'm eating too much bacon. Like they didn't worry about my health when I weighed 340 or 370, whatever it was. But at 230, they're worried that I eat too much bacon. And it's the way it was described to me. There's two mutually exclusive definitions of what a healthy diet is. So what we've been taught to think is that a healthy diet, and this is hypothetical, it's low fat, it's mostly plants, it's fruits, vegetables, and whole grains. And in theory, if we eat this, we will minimize our risk of chronic disease and live longer. But we don't actually get any information about whether it works. I mean, maybe our LDL cholesterol will come down. But other than that, if we live to be 70 or we live to be 90, we have no idea whether the diet helped or hindered us. Maybe we'd have lived longer or shorter regardless. The flip side is this definition of a healthy diet is if I tell people, my patients, to get off carbs and to replace them with healthy fats, even God help us, butter and bacon in their meals, they get healthy. So that's the diet that makes them healthy versus a diet that in theory is supposed to keep unhealthy people from getting less healthy. And for them, if you're a physician, it's very compelling. It's that simple. I get these people on these diets, they get healthy. Watching a patient lose 100 pounds without being hungry and get off medications, hypertension medications, gout medications, diabetes medications, is a very powerful and persuasive and compelling observation.
Maybe talk for a minute about hunger, because I think that's one of to the people who eat low carb, high fat, I think the hunger aspect of it is very significant.
Well, and that's one of the ideas that I'm communicating in this book is for a lifetime we've been told, we've had naturally lean people telling us how to treat obesity. So these people, and this begins in 1930 with the first physician who claims to have proven the idea that obesity is caused by eating too much. But if you're naturally lean and you eat in moderation, you tend to natural assumptions that if everyone ate in moderation, they'd be lean too. And since you believe that people who are obese get that way because they eat too much, you assume they must not be eating in moderation. And now you're getting direct implication is fat shaming, right? Because now you have to ask, why don't they eat in moderation like I do? And that's because either they don't care or they don't have the willpower. Research is now that they're genetics forces them to not have the willpower, but one way or the other, it's a bad place to go. The solution, the lean person solution, is those of us who are overweight or obese, we have to eat less, exercise more. So they put us on these diets that, we try to control how much we eat. And we've all been there. Like everyone who's overweight has been there. And you're eating, the little bit of cereal with skim milk for breakfast with maybe a grapefruit. And then for, you have some, whatever snack you allow yourself to have at 10 o'clock because you're starving. And then
rice cakes, popcorn, anything non-fat.
Exactly. And then at lunch, you have the little palm-sized serving of tuna fish on a celery, piece of lettuce. And you're thinking about food all the time. You're obsessed. And eventually—
You're exercising.
Yeah, plus you're exercising, which is making it worse, right? Because now you're burning off calories. So it used to be that exercise was known as a way to, to increase your appetite. That was sort of intuitively obvious. If you wanted somebody to have a greater appetite and be able to eat more, you tell them to exercise. Now it's supposed to reduce their fat storage. And you're not supposed to be hungry after. And if you are hungry, you're supposed to be able to just deal with it. I mean, to me, this is sort of thin people's way of telling fat people, live with hunger the rest of your life. And actually, there's a book, an anthropology book, in which one of the great anthropologists of the 20th century says, in order to cure obesity, people have to realize they have to live with being hungry the rest of their life. I have an article by a physicist at Berkeley who says a secret to curing obesity is learning to live with hunger. And it's sort of
the human body does not want hunger.
That it's human. And the thing I point out in the book, I mean, I could write in a whole other book on this, and I might someday, is one of the most famous diet trials, one of the most famous nutrition trials ever done was done during World War II by Ansel Keys, a University of Minnesota nutritionist, in which he took 30-odd conscientious objectors and semi-starved them because they wanted to understand when they liberated, assuming we won the war and we liberated Europe, Eastern Europe would be full of people who had been suffering through famine. They wanted to know how to treat these people, how to refeed them. So the military funded the study, and he fed these people 1,600 calories a day. They're men, all men, mostly lean, although few were overweight, and one might have been obese, technically obese. And 1,600 calories a day of vegetables, potatoes or turnips and lean, small portion of lean meat. And it was called the Biology, the book, 2-volume book that Keith and his collaborators wrote on this was called The Biology of Human Starvation, because if you're feeding someone only 1,600 calories a day, you're starving them. And they're starving. They were hungry all the time. They were famished. They thought about food all the time. They dreamt about food at night. They suffered from what Keyes and his colleagues called semi-starvation neurosis, and a few of them verged into psychosis. One of them cut off his fingers with an axe to get out of the study. I mean, it's insane. And then the assumption, so we know what happens when you semi-starve lean people on diets of 1,600 calories a day, which is, what if you look at websites, that's what they recommend for those of us who want to lose weight. Men, women, it's like 1,200 calories. They know that lean people can't tolerate it, and that given the opportunity, and at the end of this trial, they didn't lose a lot of weight. They lost about 20 pounds total in 6 months. And at the end of the trial, they realized that they had to slowly refeed them. They couldn't just let them have access to food because they'd eat themselves sick. And eventually they got to the point that they were eating 6,000 to 10,000 calories a day. It was crazy. And all of them ended up fatter than they started, which Keyes and his colleagues called post-starvation obesity. And we've all been there too. Those of us who struggle with their weight, it's like you try to lose weight, you try to deal with the hunger, and eventually you can't do it anymore, and you binge eat. And then the lean people blame you for not having any willpower, even though they would go through the same thing. If you fix this dysregulation of your fat accumulation, so you lower insulin, then you have access to these fat stores that you don't have access to when you're storing fat. And now you could burn that fat for fuel, and your body doesn't care whether the fuel it's getting is what's called exogenous, which you're eating from your meals, or whether it's burning endogenous fuel, which is all this fuel you've stocked away as fat. And there's copious anecdotal evidence. Actually, pretty much every clinical trial done for the better part of 50 years said you put people on these diets, they lose weight and they are not hungry. They're just not hungry. And in fact, the American Heart Association, when they went after Atkins in 1971, 72, tried to insist that this way of eating was quackish. They said it causes side effects. And among the side effects was anorexia, which is lack of appetite. And you'd think, geez, lack of appetite would be a good thing in somebody who's trying to lose weight, wouldn't it? But to the American Heart Association, it was something to avoid. We should all be hungry all the time.
Well, we're going to open it up in a minute to questions, but just kind of one last thing, and you can answer this just very quickly. But for people who might not understand kind of metabolic syndrome and kind of this, you've been talking about different aspects of metabolic syndrome, but maybe kind of the unified theory of metabolic syndrome and how that fits into insulin and keto. And then we can have Kate take the questions from the audience, because I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
That's a good question, because often these criticisms of what I'm saying in these conversations will be it's not all about weight loss. People have a lot of chronic disease issues that have to be fixed here. And part of my research, beginning with those investigative pieces for Science, was a revelation that there had always been a counter hypothesis to this idea that heart disease is caused by eating too much saturated fat, and the saturated fat raising LDL cholesterol. And this was an idea known as metabolic syndrome, which has since also become textbook medicine. So metabolic syndrome is a condition in which you have a cluster of metabolic abnormalities. So your waist circumference is getting bigger, you're getting fatter, your HDL, your good cholesterol is low, your triglycerides, which is a measurement that your doctor will make when they check your lipids, your cholesterol, your lipids are high, your triglyceride is high, your blood pressure is high, and you have bad blood sugar control, you're glucose intolerant. So these are all the metabolic abnormalities that associate with obesity and type 2 diabetes, which means roughly 3/4 of the population of the United States suffers from metabolic syndrome. And they're all related to insulin resistance. And now we're back to insulin, and insulin being the cause of that excess fat accumulation. And there was a whole world of British researchers who were arguing from the 1960s onward that the cause of heart disease and diabetes and obesity, and goes back to the case against sugar, was not the fat in the diet or the saturated fat, but the sugar and white flour. And so the metabolic syndrome story says that the same thing that makes us fat, which is insulin resistance and elevated insulin from the carbs we're eating, is the same thing that makes us sick. And so if you remove those carbs, even if you replace them with butter, God help us, your insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome will resolve because they're being caused by the carbohydrates. So not only will your weight come down, but so will your blood pressure, your diabetes will get under control. And again, physicians who do this, and in 2017, 100 some Canadian physicians wrote a letter to the HuffPost saying, look, this is the diet we eat, and this is the diet we prescribe to our patients, and we put our patients on it. Weight normalizes, blood sugar normalizes, everything gets better. Blood pressure, irritable bowel syndrome goes away, inflammatory conditions get better, gout goes away. It's an extraordinarily powerful story. The problem is our authorities got it wrong. 50 years ago, they bought into the dietary fat causes heart disease. Saturated fat is the problem, and they cannot let it go.
So Kate, now I'm going to turn it over to you to pull in the questions from the audience.
Sounds great. All right. So just a reminder to anyone, if you haven't asked your question yet, there's still time. You can still put it in the chat. I'm going to start with a question from Julie, who asks, what are the differences between how men and women fare on a keto diet?
Okay, and this is a question I asked every one of the physicians because I have plenty of women friends who swear it doesn't work as well for them. So it's quite possible it doesn't. The major difference between men and women, one major difference between men and women is that women go through periods in their life where they have to put on fat. So you get pregnant, you have mechanisms that will put on fat for you such that when the baby's born, you can nurse the baby. And I think that makes it harder. But the doctors I interviewed, 50% said anyone can do this. Well, first of all, everyone will get healthier. So one way or the other, the argument is you're going to get healthier eating this way than you are, a carb-rich, sugar-rich diet for sure. The question is, will it be as easy to lose weight? Anecdotally, as women get older, the answer is no. But the other flip side is that if you do want to control your weight, this is, in essence, I'm arguing this is the only way to do it. So starving yourself won't be a solution. One way or the other, you're going to have to lower the carb content of the diet, and that will give you the best shot. And the phrase I used, going all the way back to why we get fat, is the leanest you can be will be on the diet with the least carbohydrates, men or women. But the leanest as you can be might not be as lean as you would like or imagine.
We've had several people ask a question along the same lines about being vegetarian. David says, I found it very difficult to find enough satisfying foods that are keto, partly because I try to be mostly vegetarian. And we have another attendee who says, is it possible to maintain a keto diet if you are a vegetarian but not a vegan?
And the answer is yes. I mean, first thing I would do is just Google vegetarian ketogenic or vegan ketogenic diets. You'll find Facebooks dedicated to the practice with, tens of thousands of members. It is also harder because plant foods tend to come with carbohydrates attached. That's the fuel system for plants. Animal source foods are, with the exception of milk, almost exclusively protein and fat, which is what you want to be eating. It can certainly be done. I discuss it in the book. One of the physicians I interviewed at length, who is a spine surgeon in Ohio named Carrie Doulis, who has a family history of obesity and also has type 1 diabetes. and finds that she can't tolerate animal products. So she eats a vegan ketogenic diet. And, it's not easy to create a well-formulated, nutritionally adequate vegan or vegetarian diet. The women, the doctors I spoke to who eat that way inevitably said they tell their patients, if you have no ethical issues with eating animals, do it. And ideally, if nothing else, eat eggs. My wife is a mostly vegetarian, and eggs are a major source of protein and fat in her diet.
I eat so many eggs. It's unbelievable.
Yeah, so it's sort of, but it's just, if you can eat, if you have no ethical or issues with eating animals, it certainly makes life easier. But I think we all struggle with that, especially in this day and age.
We also have some questions recommending recipe books, which I'm very interested in. And here's one from Antoinette. Can you recommend a good place to start to find recipes and meal plans? I read your books and I'm convinced I just don't know where to start. The internet is very overloaded and confusing, which I agree.
Yeah, it is overloaded and confusing. And unfortunately, while I'm slowly learning how to cook in my 60s, that's because my wife won't cook meat. So if anyone's going to do it, if I'm going to eat it, I have to cook it. I am not a good judge of what makes a good recipe book. So I have like the Nom Nom Paleo books. I've got, what is the name? I would trust Amazon and Goodreads and Google Books, regrettably, more than I would trust myself on this. I also always preferred quantity over quality, being somewhat of a large man. So I'm not the best person to choose, because if I get a large portion, I'm pretty much happy.
All right, we have a question from Nancy Lyons, who asks, can't we take a drug to lower insulin rather than cut out carbs?
The problem with that is your body is a very complex, intricate, the term is homeostatic system. And that means that everything is working together, every hormone, the nervous system, they're all working together to make sure that the conditions for life thriving inside your body are met. And so you have a hormone like insulin that's so vital to so many different tasks. So for instance, you could argue, I suspect, because we have to control our blood sugar, because elevated blood sugar is toxic, that's one reason why the same hormone that tells your lean tissue to burn blood sugar is a hormone that tells your fat tissue to store fat, so that you can get the blood sugar taken care of in the short run and the fat in the long run. And your body is doing all these calculations and effects simultaneously, unconsciously. And if you just come up with a drug to try and fix something, it's almost guaranteed that, like, for instance, the reason your body is storing too much fat is because it's secreting too much insulin, probably because you're insulin resistant, because of the metabolizing of the sugar in the liver cells. So that's the beginning of the complication. So if you now just lower insulin secretion, whatever reason your body is responding to insulin resistance by raising insulin is going to now be dysfunctional, and you're going to have a problem somewhere else. It's going to be like whack-a-mole. So if you whack it in one place, the problem is going to manifest itself somewhere else. And life being what it is, it's likely to be worse there. And this is why every drug that works, every biologically active molecule has both beneficial effects and detrimental effects. And we test them in randomized clinical trials to make sure that the benefits outweigh the risks. And there are drugs, by the way, and then relatively benign drugs like metformin, which is an insulin sensitizing drugs, that will help you with these things. And if they help on the fat tissue, they will be advertised as, your doctor would know that taking metformin is associated with some fat loss. Ultimately, the argument I'm making and others is that carbohydrates are causing you this metabolic issue in your body, this metabolic disturbance. And one of the manifestations of that is excess fat being stored. The healthiest you could be is if you just remove the problem. Then the body will work homeostatically the way it's supposed to work. And your body will actually work like lean people's bodies work naturally. So that's that's the argument. The other, I don't know if there is another issue. Let's leave it at that.
All right, there's so many great questions to pour through here. This one, Gretchen, I'm curious to hear what you have to say on it too. How do you feel about alternative sweeteners like monk fruit?
My feeling, and again, this is not an area where I'm an expert, and the evidence on whether these, well, I think they're all benign compared to sugar, in large part because they're so much sweeter than sugar that you can use them in so much smaller doses. I think probably none of them have really been studied adequately in terms of long-term deleterious effects, but some of them have been around for so long, like saccharin or cyclamates. I forget which one has been around since the 1890s. Stevia has been used in Central America and Japan as a sweetener in Central America for hundreds of years and in Japan for decades. So we can be pretty confident they're benign. In an ideal world, what you want to do is lose your sweet tooth, and it can be done. Oh, this was the one thing I was going to say about removing the carbs. It seems daunting, but the reason, and in part because we all crave carbohydrates. I could say something like, hot donuts, and half of us will start salivating without even thinking about it, including myself. We crave carbs if you're insulin resistant, which you almost assuredly are if you're overweight or obese or diabetic. Carbs are your fuel. Carbs are what your body burns for fuel. The insulin, it not only tells your fat to store fat, but it tells your lean tissue to burn carbohydrates and not to burn fat for fuel. So you crave carbs because that's the only thing you could eat that will actually fuel your cells. When you shift to a low carb, high fat diet or ketogenic diet, which is the extreme version of it, you're shifting your body from running on carbohydrates to running on fat. And a very common anecdotal observation, and actually this was shown in animal studies 80 years ago, is that your cravings will shift from carb cravings to fat cravings. Like I don't crave donuts. I mean, I will if I think about it, but if I don't think about it, I'll crave butter and bacon. I'll crave fatty foods, and that's, so what happens is people sort of, their tastes shift. So you think, how could I live my life without bagels? In the same way, 20 years ago, I used to think, how could I live my life without cigarettes? And then 3 years later, you're thinking, Jesus, giving up bagels is the best thing I ever did. I couldn't imagine eating one. And just like I couldn't imagine smoking a cigarette. It's the way, what happens when you shift from running your body from carbs to fat.
That's very true. I had the same experience when I was diagnosed with celiac. I thought, how could I live without bagels? And it was hard, but a few years later, I don't think about bagels anymore, except with nostalgia,
Yeah, or if you go to breakfast and you're Sunday brunch with your friends and they're all eating bagels and they're toasted and there's butter and cream cheese on them, and you may even go, okay, I'm going to deal with 1-2 days of celiac and have the negative sequelae of this disease and then have my bagel. But if you're not around them, they just, it's funny because when I first tried keto as an experiment, this was 20 years ago and it was still called Atkins. The thing that was hardest for me to give up was orange juice. Fresh orange juice in the morning was my luxury in life. And I couldn't imagine living without it. And it took me about 3 weeks before the urge to drink orange juice in the morning went away. And now I couldn't imagine drinking orange juice any more than I could imagine smoking a cigarette. It's just, I mean, I know it wouldn't kill me, but I can't imagine doing it or why I would want to do it. So.
All right, we have, this is a really good question. Is there any downside to being on a keto diet for a person who's already lean and generally healthy?
I doubt it. Okay, you can't say anything. Again, one of the points I make in this book is in an ideal world, we would have clinical trials of tens of thousands of subjects in which half of them ate a ketogenic diet for 10 years and half of them ate a Mediterranean diet. for 10 years. And I could tell you that there's a 70% probability that if you ate a Mediterranean diet instead of a keto diet, you would live a year longer or 3 years longer. But we don't have those trials. For the most part, you're just not eating carbs and replacing them with fat. And, as a species, we didn't evolve eating carbohydrates other than the occasional tubers that had to be soaked in water for 12 hours to get the poisons out of them before they were cooked. So I can't imagine that not eating donuts and sweets and drinking Coke could be bad for you, but maybe I just don't have enough of an imagination. But so I would say almost assuredly not, but anything's possible.
All right, I'm going to revisit the topic of eggs because it seems to be popular in the Q&A. Alan asks, a recent large study of the health effects of eggs warned that eating too many is harmful for your heart. Does the keto diet encourage an unhealthy amount of eggs?
Well, first of all, the term too many is always tautological, right? If you do too much of anything, it by definition is bad for you. And if you eat too many of anything, then by definition, you've done yourself harm. The question is, within reason, is there such a thing as eating too many eggs? And again, one of my learning experience in this field, before I even thought about obesity, other than my own personal weight problems, I had spent a decade writing about in public health and recognizing that it's something of a pseudoscience. So this idea that eggs are bad for you comes from studies where you take what's called a cohort, a population, like say 130,000 nurses of the famous Nurses Health Study, and then you ask them what they're eating and what their lifestyle is like, and then you follow them for 20 or 30 years, and you see who gets sick and who doesn't, and then you compare what the people who got sick are eating to the ones who stayed healthy, and lo and behold, you find that the ones who stay healthy are the ones who followed your health advice. So basically, the health conscious individuals listened to what you were saying when the study was started, which was don't eat eggs, don't eat bacon, don't eat red meat, don't eat processed meat, stay away from saturated fat and butter, and eat mostly plants and olive oil. And then 30 years later, you find out that the people who did all that live longer. Technically, what you've discovered, and you've probably heard this, is an association between egg consumption and health. And now you want to know, is that association causal? Does eating more eggs make people die prematurely? And the way you study that is with a clinical trial of the kind I just described that we don't have. So there's actually no compelling clinical trial evidence that eggs are bad for you. It's pretty much that simple. And then you would ask, why would eggs be bad for us, since we've been eating eggs as a species, probably as long as we've been a species? And you could spin up reasons in your head, but they're not very compelling to those of us who think critically. I don't know. So the answer is, I don't believe that eating eggs, that there is an unhealthy amount. I mean, I imagine if you ate nothing but 20 eggs a day, that would be bad, and that would be too many. But we're talking about 3 eggs for breakfast. And even if it was bad, this was one of the revelations from my first major article for the journal Science. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, 3 research groups took on the challenge of trying to establish how bad saturated fat was for you by asking the question, let's imagine that everyone cut their saturated fat consumption from what we consider unhealthy to what we would consider healthy, and their cholesterol numbers dropped accordingly. How much longer would they live? And this was a group at Harvard, a group at, I think it was McGill in Canada, and the third group was UCSF here in the Bay Area, University of California, San Francisco. And the answer was that if you followed the government's advice and it worked perfectly and there were no negative side effects, which we now know there were plenty, you would live like a couple of weeks to a couple months longer than otherwise, on average. So, and one of the researchers who did this, guy at UCSF, actually wrote, he was funded by the Surgeon General's office, and then they tried to stop his paper from being published because they didn't want the country to know how tiny these effects were, you know, a few weeks to a few months. And when I interviewed him, he said, you realize that it's not a few weeks to a few months on your honeymoon, right? It's a few weeks to a few months at the end of your life. So if normally you would die at 75 years old in like March of 2030, now you'll die at 75 years old in late April 2030. Is that worth a life without butter? And to me, no. So even best case scenario, they're right about everything they said. I'm going to give up those last 6 weeks and eat my butter. To other people, they might make that decision differently.
All right. So a question from Lauren, and this might be our last question we have time for. I'm going to watch the clock on this, but Lauren asks, given that what works for one person won't necessarily work for another, could you and Gretchen walk through what a typical day of food looks like for both of you?
We discussed the possibility we'd get this question. Gretchen, you want to go first?
Okay, so I begin my day with the chaffle, and if you're interested in this, I urge you to go online. Chaffle, C-H-A-F-F-L-E. This is a way of making eggs and cheese into this delicious waffle thing. It's amazing. Or I have scrambled eggs, so I have that for breakfast. For lunch, I usually have leftovers, so maybe it's salmon, maybe it's a hamburger, maybe it's steak, maybe it's a Cobb salad, like with avocado, bacon, and eggs, and all the Cobb salad-y kind of thing. Or I love frittatas. Like I do eat a lot of eggs, so I would eat eggs in a lot of different forms. And then for dinner, I usually would have something like salmon or a burger. And it's kind of funny because, you can have the burger and the cheese, you just can't have the bun and the fries. So that's kind of what I eat. I was just telling Gary earlier, I was eating a lot of nuts. I was eating a lot of almonds as like my go-to snack. And I think that my almond consumption had gotten a little bit out of hand. So now I'm switching to black olives as my snack. And I eat full fat Greek yogurt as well. I have that every day as my afternoon snack.
Okay, and I, about 4 years ago, I tried intermittent fasting. 3 years ago, intermittent fasting is an experiment, which is a fancy way for saying I stopped eating after dinner and I don't eat breakfast anymore. It took me about 3 days I was traveling. So for 3 days, I just had to avoid airplane food, which was pretty easy. And after 3 days, I found that I wasn't hungry in the morning anymore. I have zero desire to eat breakfast, and I have more energy and more mental clarity in the morning. So I typically don't eat until noon or 1 o'clock. Recently, I've been eating a lot of chicken salad from the local restaurant that I can say I'm supporting. It's also because they cut up grapes and put them in the chicken salad, which I wouldn't recommend if you're doing hardcore keto, but because my weight is good and my health is good, I'm cheating by eating grapes in my chicken salad. I will often have with it the green salad as well. And snacks, I also gave up nuts recently as an experiment and have been eating pork rinds, which sound better if you call them pepperoni. And dinner is a lot like Gretchen's, basically meat, fish, or fowl with green vegetables. I cook dinner for the family 4 or 5 nights a week. We get dinner boxes. My wife chooses the boxes, so they tend to be GARY friendly, but they'll come with starches. So I'll make the starches and for my kids, and I'll just eat the green vegetables and whatever the protein fat portion is. And I try not to eat after dinner.
Oh, and I should have said also that I eat tons of cauliflower and broccoli and green beans too. I forgot about that, but yes.
Yeah, well, that's in part of the, you just start switching. The world is, I mean, so many people are doing this now that not only are there wonderful foods you could buy and you can find keto, friendly dinner boxes to be delivered. You've also got cauliflower rice and zucchini noodles and sort of keto-friendly almond flour baked goods. You can replace virtually everything that you used to eat. Some taste better than what you used to eat. The zucchini noodles has never been, to me, a pasta replacement, but other people swear by it. There are pizzas you can have delivered, and there are, local pizza places that sell low-carb keto-friendly pizzas with almond flour or cauliflower flour crust. Is that possible? Anyway, it's just so.
It is, they're good.
Yeah, but most of it is just, if I'm not talking at a keto event, it's just, I just don't eat sugar, starches, and grains anymore. And breakfast, I don't eat that anymore.
Well, this has been so delightful to have you both here tonight. I don't know if you have any closing words before I wrap things up.
Well, I would just say, again, if you're interested in another interview with Gary, you can go onto my website, GretchenRubin.com, and go to resources, and you can get it there, because I think he's so fascinating. I mean, if you want to read more about kind of like how I was hit by the lightning bolt of reading this, in my book, Better Than Before, I describe like how I switched overnight, like what went into the effects of it, and also why I think it's easier for some people, like for Gary and me, to have none rather than to try to have a little bit. A lot of people try to have a little bit, but for a lot of people, it's actually easier to have none, abstainers versus moderators. So I urge everybody to read Gary's work, because as I said, it changed my life. It changed my father's life. It made our lives happier and healthier. And what's better than that?
And I just want to thank Harvard Bookstore again. And Gretchen, you're terrific. And if I could only have you talking about my books all the time.
Believe me, I do. Believe me, I do. People around me are like, okay, fine. Yeah.
Yeah. But, and the moderators and abstainers, I discussed this in the case for keto. Everybody, when they do this, the idea is, what can I not so much anymore. It used to be the question of, can I eat this? Can I eat that? For many of us, and this is certainly true of sugar, it's just easier to abstain entirely than it is to try and moderate. And the physicians I spoke to, some of them thought the worst message you can give someone who struggles with obesity or diabetes is to try and eat in moderation. So I wrote the case for keto just to sort of teach us to communicate everything I had learned about how to think about this. And I had learned it from some wonderful people, not just people have become friends like Gretchen, but these physicians who I now all think of as friends. And it's just, it's so important. And this is a message, actually, I spent a lot of time going after Michael Pollan and his food 7 words of advice. But Michael pointed out in Defense of Food that we should work as hard at eating healthy as we do any other aspect of our life. And vegetarians do this naturally. People who choose to eat vegan diets do this naturally. And those of us who struggle with our weight, if we put in the work and we put in the effort, put in that practice, it becomes almost effortless. So anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you both tremendously for your fascinating conversation tonight. And thank you, listeners, for your amazing questions. We had so many that I wish we could have gotten to, but thank you for spending your evening with us and for your support. Feel free to learn more about this book and purchase The Case for Keto on harvard.com, as well as Gretchen's other lovely books like Better Than Before. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a good night, keep reading, and please be well. Take care.